Hello again and welcome to Looking at Social Justice. I'm the Director of Social Justice Ministry for the Diocese of Fresno, Jim Grant, and it's my privilege to be here today with Daniel O'Connell, who happens to be the Executive Director of Central Valley Partnership. This is a group of progressive activists, community leaders, and also organizations spanning the whole Central Valley here. Dr. O'Connell is going to be talking about one topic in particular, Quakers in the San Joaquin Valley and the impact of this wonderful community. But before he starts, I just wanted to say that I've met Daniel several times over the last months. Once was at the Interfaith Scholar Weekend that we met with that scholar from Fordham about water. Then we met at the SEIU 2015 celebrations at St. John's Cathedral. Then we met at the Democratic Socialists of America meeting. And finally, we had the pleasure, I did, of being at one of Dr. O'Connell's meetings with Central Valley partners who met at their partnership meeting about a week ago. On that note, Dan, could you introduce us to anything else we need to know about you and the Quakers in the Central Valley?
Well, it's interesting how life guides you. When I was young, I wanted to be a Franciscan priest and
you still
monk,
be?
And so, and I feel like I still walk in those values. Two things have brought me to the Valley. One is being a scholar. I wrote my doctoral dissertation, and I did my master's work at Davis, my dissertation at Cornell on a history of the Valley and its socioeconomic and cultural issues. But the other trend or tradition that I walk within is as a Quaker. When I first came here to do my research, I emailed a Quaker farmer, Bill Lovett, and asked if I could stay on his property, and he said yes, and I was already well involved with Quakers. Just a bit of a background with Quakers. Sometimes it's easiest to just describe them by two things, their testimonies and by the phrase, "let your life speak." So Quakers will recognize that there's that of God in each person, and that implies a lot of other things, including a deep nonviolent stance. But they also tend to be oriented to 5 testimonies. 1 is simplicity, 2 is peace, 3 is integrity. So Quakers are obligated to tell the truth and discern what God is telling them. So they almost become mystical once they discern a leading. They are obligated to follow it, and they should never lie. Community, Quakers, though you have individual Quakers make tremendous activist stances in the world, Quakers make corporate decision making. They make decisions as a group. And equality. So Quakers were at the forefront of the women's suffrage movement, of the Underground Railroad, anti-slavery movements. These were all very much Quaker-led movements in the United States and England. So it gives you a little bit of an orientation to Quakers, and to me, being a scholar and an activist, if you will. I want to realize social justice in the world, and I connect economic and social justice to our democracy, to the actual ability to have a civic structure and to participate in democratic institutions. So that brings me here today, both the traditions of being a scholar, but in particular to talk about this history of Quakers in the San Joaquin Valley of California.
When you gave me the topic, I must admit, I said, this will be great because I know nothing about this. So this is a learning experience for me. With which couple, with which group, with which person do you want to start introducing us to these major figures who have set the direction of Quaker life here in the Valley, Quaker social action?
Well, let's start with the American Friends Service Committee, that after World War II gets the Nobel Peace Prize for their work in post-war Europe. And it's the Quaker service arm or action arm. So the American Friends Service Committee, Quakers have been active in California since the 30s. They begin to become more formally oriented to the AFSC, American Friends Service Committee, in about 1942. And in particular, there's a location called Hidden Valley Ranch in Santa Clara Valley where Josephine and Frank Duveneck own that property. They've since passed away and gave that property away to social justice and peace interests. Fred Ross who was the main organizer and advisor to Cesar Chavez and Saul Alinsky, was often housed there. And the AFSC first hired Cesar Chavez as an assistant to Fred Ross. As the Quakers became more active in California through AFSC, they realized that the San Joaquin Valley was exhibiting itself as an extraordinary context of injustice and economic inequality. So they made a purposeful choice to engage in the valley.
Good that they did that, because in a sense things haven't really changed in all those decades, in the sense of the valley being quite unequal, quite disparate in where wealth and energy is. So it's a great field of work for not only Quakers, but for all of us.
Well, much has changed, but it's subterranean, there's deep roots, and you'll see that change within. By the time we're off the planet, the San Joaquin Valley will be doing much better, and it's because of a lot of history of people before us. It's interesting, when I did my research, I was looking at the archives in Berkeley for Paul Taylor, who starts my dissertation research, an ag economist at Berkeley, and I saw a letter he wrote to the AFSC pleading them to engage in the San Joaquin Valley, and I often wondered whether they hadn't responded to that, but it was definitely a lot of activists in San Francisco and bringing on people like Cesar Chavez and wanting to participate in social justice movements with especially the Latino community that was orienting them. So the beginnings are AFSC hires Bard and Olga Mccallister. Olga just passed away a year ago at 98.
Wow.
I was with her throughout the entire journey at the end of her life. I never knew Bard Mccallister. So Bard Mccallister had a background in self-help housing, having people participate in building their own affordable housing, sweat equity. But when he first arrived out here, he famously did not do anything except go to work as a farm worker. So he was a tall, white guy that didn't speak Spanish, but to understand the issues that was facing farm workers, which was his main charge to help the farm worker movement, which wasn't a movement, I wouldn't say, in the 1950s, he began working as a farm worker. He also, him and Olga, who are moderate folks, were charged at that time in Tulare County, they moved to Visalia, as being communists and socialists in the parlance of the McCarthyite 1950s. They were anything but. And so over time, from their living room, they start a number of institutions. The first thing they start is the Farm Labor Committee, and that's going to be the nexus point. And I was one of the last members of that committee before it was laid down. And then from there, in their living room, they start a number of initiatives. Bard was active with Audubon and a conservationist. He started SciCon, the outdoor science school of Tulare County. But most important, perhaps, is self-help enterprises. Starts in his living room. And Bard was an expert in community development. And he had this aphorism that often has motivated me, because we do work in places where there's high poverty and there's little resources, and you have to start. And he said, if money is your only problem, you don't have any problems. So don't that has proven true for me time and time again. Community, even a very small number of people, can solve the most intractable problems. And so I never knew Bard, but it was great to be able to walk in his footsteps and to know Olga at the end of her life. She would tell me that Cesar Chavez would often call Bard to ask advice on nonviolence and community development. It felt similar to how maybe Martin Luther King used Bayard Rustin, the gay Quaker who was a deep advisor to an organizer of the March on Washington, but this is a smaller context, but at a similar moment in the civil rights movement in California.
So another couple that you are wanting to tell us about, I think, is Bob and Joy Marshall. Where do they fit in the sequence? What was their major contribution to what Quaker energy is here in the Valley?
So Bob and Joy are still alive, and just to give a little bit of history, I'm not sure why, but at a certain moment, Bard and Olga end up moving to Zambia and doing community development work for about 10 to 15 years in Africa. And so a person named Howard Washburn was hired on as the executive director of Self-Help Enterprises at that moment. Bob arrived in California, drove up to the Washburns' house. He was hired by American Friends Service Committee to be a director or program manager. And as he arrived at the Washburn house, Howard says, I'm leaving on vacation. When I come back, I'll orient you to your work. We'll see you in a week. And within an hour or two, a direct head-on crash killed Howard, his wife, and 2 of their 4 daughters.
Oh my God.
And so at that moment, Bob ended up becoming the executive director of this burgeoning farm, institution of farm workers building their own houses. So Self-Help Enterprises ends up growing into a phenomenal organization. It's not a Quaker organization, but it's embedded with certain values and initial leadership. So again, I mentioned sweat equity. The Quakers don't, even though many of us are activists, often we should be sitting in the middle of problems and solving them. And so building farm worker housing was a really productive and positive way to participate in the movement. I once asked Bob, well, you're the executive director of a nonprofit. How are you in a contentious era when you're having to work with farmers? And Bard, by the way, worked with farmers and farm workers. And I said, what did you do during protests? It was the 1960s and 70s. He goes, I would be in the back a little bit, and we participated. So the balance of being an activist, but also doing work to bring people together and build community is a delicate balance in a context of intense political divisiveness. And Quakers often try to bring people together. And so I've had the pleasure of knowing Bob and Joy for years now, and they're still in Visalia in their 90s now. Yeah.
What about the Lovitts? Do they follow sequentially right after, or how do they connect with the Marshalls, and what are they doing?
So,
what have they done?
So the difference between Bill and Bob is interesting. Bob Marshall and Bill Lovitt. And it shows those 2 different temperaments of Quakers. Bob Marshall, during World War II, was a conscientious objector and chose to do nonviolent service in the United States, I think as a firefighter. And Bill Lovitt, at 18 years old, was in Mexico doing a Quaker service project when the war started, World War II. Now, since Mennonites, Quakers, and Brethren, other peace churches were tortured often and incarcerated during the First World War, they lobbied in the interim decades and had the out of being conscientious objectors. Well, that wasn't offered to secular people, and Bill Lovitt chose, in solidarity with secular activists, to go to federal prison as a conscientious against the war. So for 4 years, Bill Lovitt was in jail, and he was much more of an activist, whereas Bob was, by temperament, a manager and a convener. So you have those 2 different sides of Quakerism that goes back to George Fox disrupting churches and Margaret Fell convening and institutionalizing a religion. So Bill Lovitt was, after he got out of prison, he entered in with Dave Dellinger, an anarchist co-op, where they ran a print shop. And so he was an explicit anarchist, a radical, if you will. Over time, when I met him, he was an old man. But he still had sayings like, I don't think that the way that Europeans have chosen to own land is just. We should have followed the Indians, and we shouldn't own land. And he, at the end of his life, was successful in donating his 25-acre farm with his wife, Beth, to share to a sharing nonprofit between the Wachumna Indians, Mixtec Indians, Unitarians, and Quakers, just outside of Visalia, and today it's called Quaker Oaks Farm. So those testimonies were deeply embedded in Bill, who was a 5th or 6th generation Quaker. And so Bill Lovitt, if you knew him, up until the end of his life, was an activist in the deepest way. His wife was just the opposite, and Olga Mccallister also. Bard Mccallister would wear this bright red beret and would be out there in public figures. But their wives, Olga and Beth, Olga once said, I'm the Brown Cardinal. And the Brown Cardinal means that a female needs to bird. Often male birds are bright and colorful. Females are more camouflaged because you don't want to be showy if you're protecting eggs. And so Olga and Beth were often Brown Cardinals that without them, the activism of their husbands would have never been realized. And we, doing community work need to realize there's a role for everyone in social justice work.
If somebody went to Quaker Oaks Farm now, what would be there for them to see?
I often think, again, that this is a project that has deep roots because Bill tried to get it going for 30 years. He tried to give it away, but Quakers need to collectively agree. Everyone needs to agree, and they disagreed whether they should accept property. So $1 million to $2 million property, a few Quaker grandmothers thought they shouldn't take the property, and so he patiently waited most of his life to give it away. At the end of his life, the Friends meeting accepted the property. Today, in the back of that property, Wachumna Indians hold sweats and ceremony. You have the beginning of an agroecological farm, of farming practices that are not monocultures, that are diverse, integrated management systems, and both with the natural environment and with people. And you have native farm workers from Oaxaca that have a community garden, and we continue to offer spaces that they can grow their own food and market it. They're both, Beth Levitt, Bill died a month ago and Beth died a few days ago. So it's deeply in transition. Bill had a famous salvage yard that was on 3 acres, so just cleaning that is going to be something. There's 2 barns, the meeting house is there, and so it's still in process. And from a deep bed of roots and effort, I think now you'll see, it's named after Valley Oak, right, which is just a magnificent tree. And we'll see over the years to come whether we can build that above ground infrastructure from this base of values and goodness.
Speaking of goodness, there's another person on your list for me to learn about, Graciela Martinez. Where does Graciela fit into this other litany of tremendous Quaker activists and scholars and people that are committed to the earth and to the equal distribution and working with indigenous peoples? Where does Graciela fit in?
So Graciela Martinez is a very close personal friend of mine and a mentor of mine. And so she started out making photocopies for Bart and Olga Mccallister. And before that, she was down in Delano, I think babysitting for many of the leaders of the movement early on. And over the course of her life, she ended up taking on more and more responsibilities and learning. Quaker, those institutions, self-help or SciCon, you would never even guess that they were Quaker-led, because Quakers will initiate projects and then hand them off. And so they nurture something until it has its own legs. And in some ways, they build people too. So Graciela comes from a single mom who was a farm worker, and Olga in particular, helped Graciela over the course of her life, as did Beth, and Bob and Bill also. So here's a photo of Graciela Martinez here. She ended up being one of the final, the Farm Labor Committee that Bart Mccallister started, ended up becoming incorporated into a nonprofit called Proyecto Campesino. They had a radio show that Graciela was one of the announcers of. Ernesto Laredo and Pablo Espinoza. Pablo was a leader of the UFW for a time. They both were executive directors before Graciela, and so Graciela was the last substantial director of Proyecto Campesino, which, based out of Tulare, was the education and mobilization arm of a farm, trying to educate farm workers about their rights, civic rights, and civil rights, and economic and social justice issues. So, yeah, she's continues to be an active member of the meeting, and it's a little bit sad that Proyecto Campesino has now been laid down, and by the Farm Labor Committee, which I was a member of at the end, with Bob, Bill, Joy, Olga, Beth, and Graciela. But you know, there's so much, many other groups that are doing organizing, and in fact the UFW and other unions, but also on the civic and nonprofit side that are advocating for farm workers. the agricultural system in the valley, I think, is also in transition, moving towards mechanization substantially. So Graciela Martinez continues to be a vocal advocate. She was a farm worker herself, and seeing how, I think with her, you see the changes in Quakerism and in institutions that are Quaker-based like AFSC, with empowering new leaders, and particularly women and women of color, and building them up.
Now, the part of AFSC that I've been connected with in the diocese for a good while is with the local community of the Pan Valley Institute, with Myrna Martinez and that wonderful group that now is celebrating 20 years of ministry here. Can you give us an update? We're going to visit with Myrna a little later, a couple months, but do you want to tell us how the situation is with AFSC at present and what Pan Valley is doing from your point of view?
So the Pan Valley Institute was conceptualized out of what I think Miles Horton did with the Highlander Center. Are you familiar with the Highlander Center?
No.
So the Highlander Center was first labor organizing with unions in Tennessee or Kentucky. But it was during the civil rights movement that they did deep educational projects, especially with the leadership of the civil rights movement. Rosa Parks was there, Martin Luther King. And so initially, and you'll see in the description of what the Pan Valley Institute, which is now, after the Pan Valley Institute, Proyecto Campesino was laid down, now the only real AFSC project that I'm aware of substance is the Pan Valley Institute. So they were conceptualized along the lines of a Highlander Center for the San Joaquin Valley. They do an incredible amount of cultural work, and I'm dropping the name of a wonderful festival that they have.
Tamaljavi.
Tamaljavi. And it also, this kind of narrative comes back into my work as a scholar, because Isa Fujimoto was instrumental in partnering with the AFSC to start the first Central Valley Partnership, and to realize, which was different than mine, it was Irvine Foundation inspired, and to help facilitate and build the first Tamaljavi festivals, which are, I think, is the best expression of what AFSC is doing now, which is doing deep cultural work, often with women, often with indigenous women, to empower them. And I think politics follows culture and policy follows politics, so doing deep cultural work is maybe the most fundamental and foundational work you can do, and that's what Myrna and the Pan Valley Institute are engaged in at this time.
I remember way back for the first Tamaljavi festival, Myrna was in touch over how would the diocese connect with it. And what we did is really, and it brings up the memory of Dan Lopez, who was one of our great producers and one of our great directors of a lot of our filming, was able to commit to that committee and to be involved for the first several years of that wonderful cultural festival. And it brings joy to my heart to remember that is going back many years, but it was wonderful in its rooting. And we are celebrating 20 years now of the Pan Valley Institute, doing good things for the community that used to be more known as AFSC.
Yeah, it's, when you think about how you create change in a place like the San Joaquin Valley, already you have incredibly powerful structures of oppression sitting on people who often aren't able to vote, are immigrants, and speak different languages. And this goes back 100 years. And so doing work, intersectional work across lines of difference, whether it's gender, whether it's race, whether it's economic and class, is tough, slow work. Often foundations don't have the patience for this. Often it has to be led by people from a religious or spiritual disposition. And so I'm really hopeful. I'm so happy that it's continuing, and I think we're going to now see in the region a substantial amount of change happening above. The roots are there. Now it'll happen. I think after you've had the Braceros program and you had an encouragement of residency from Mexico, those people had children that are here. And those children now are old enough to have gone away to college and to have come back. And demographically, this region now is situated with people who know the context of how their parents were abused and taken advantage of, and are very well situated both linguistically and culturally to be advocates. And so the environmental justice movement, groups like the Community Water Center, or Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability, or the Center on Race, Poverty, and Environment, these aren't religious institutions, but I think that they will be the forefront, along with just a mobilization of people of color, will begin to vote, and you'll see a pretty rapid transformation of the Valley. And I'm really hopeful that we're going to get it right here. I'm very hopeful for the Valley.
I am so glad that that's the way the program might be sort of ending. We've got only like 2 minutes to know that it's on a happy note, that even if the situation at present might seem very dire nationally and internationally, with a lot that goes on in the world, there's a lot of tremendous repression, a lot of people's rights being totally disregarded. But I love that you feel, Dan, that there is a base, there is some rooting, and it's going to grow. And we have the people here now, and we have energy. Now, you did show me the booklet.
Can I leave it on one note also? There's times I become despondent. There's times that I am afraid and I'm anxious. And I recognize those times as a loss of faith. If you're walking, Graciela Martinez would often tell me, Dios por delante, Dan. God, because she faced much more hardships than me. I say, how you survive them? She goes, I have faith that God goes before me. Do we have faith that God's walking before us, and make sure as much as we can to follow? But if we're doing that, what do we have to be afraid of? And there is no sacrifice and there is no suffering then, because you are shielded to a degree, and protected and validated and supported by that presence. Yeah.
You've got this little booklet by Eduardo Stanley. Do you want to just show us, because you say he has captured in this book a lot of what we talked about.
So AFSC was going to lay down Proyecto Campesino. It's very hard to do because of the history there. All that history I spoke of is in this small pamphlet, and AFSC hired Eduardo Stanley to compile this. He's the husband of Myrna, and he went through their archives both in Philadelphia and the Bay Area, a rich archive. Quakers are literate and they keep thorough notes, and so there was a lot there, many of them quoted in here. So this book is a small pamphlet that he drafted as this wonderful project that started with BARD, and the Farm Labor Committee was laid down, and the work continues but under different names.
I want to thank Dr. Daniel O'Connell for being here today to speak for the Quaker contribution to the Valley, which endures and continues. I want to let you know that we're so glad that we'll be having Eduardo and Myrna on future programs. I want to let you know that right now you're watching this program, I think, as a video on YouTube, but we are going to be having it available very soon for all of you who would like to hear it on podcast situations. So be ready to be in touch with the diocese, with me personally, over how you can be involved more with looking at social justice. Till next time, I'm Jim Grant. God bless.